Greetings, my fellow knights. Tonight we journey into the legendary life of Hercules, the strongest of heroes, whose trials and labors became the stuff of myth. But before you drift into comfort, I ask you as a fellow knight of these tales to like and subscribe, and in the comments, share what legends or myths you would have us explore next. Now, let us begin. Chapter 1. Birth in Thebes and the Cradle Snakes. A child was born in Thebes under an open sky, and the gods and the city both took notice in their steady ways. Inside Alcmene's house, a small hearth crackled while the mother rested and the servants kept their steady watch by the doorway. The child would be called Hercules in later telling. Though he first lay nameless, swaddled and breathing slow, new to the world, he came to Alcmene after a long season of waiting, when her husband Amphitryon was away and her prayers had grown patient and plain. Zeus, who loved bold houses and steady hearts, visited her in a form that passed like mist through the mortal order of things. So the child's blood held a measure of that high power, though his mother's arms and the city's rules would be the ground he knew. Hera watched from her own place, not soothed by oaths or stories, and her gaze lingered where the little one slept near the doorway. In those days, Thebes lived by simple customs, counted grain, repaired walls, and marked births with clean water and short, grateful words. No herald spoke about glory, no singer carved praise, and the mother only asked for steady growth and a safe roof overhead. Yet the child's breath was strong, and the line of trouble that followed such births had already found its way toward that house. In these years, Thebes stood with its gates facing the fields, and the houses clung to the slope that held the road south. At first light, a pale band of dawn lay across the stones, and the city stirred in the usual ways that mark simple mornings. Alcmene's home sat within those walls, plain and well kept, with a courtyard where jars were set, and with a narrow sleeping room. Amphitryon had built his place with earnings from his work and journeys, and he expected nothing more than peace and good harvests. The child lay there, wrapped and small, while his mother counted her blessings, and the women of the house moved with practiced care. Word passed that Alcmene had delivered safely, and friends came with bread and simple gifts, while Amphitryon offered thanks in the courtyard. He believed the child was his, as any husband would, and he made plans for training, for land, and for a place among neighbors. Zeus kept his distance, as he always did after such visits, letting the mortal roof hold the new life in its early months. High above, Hera kept her counsel and watched the family where her rival's child lay, measuring her patience against her pride. It looked like any other birth to the street beyond the wall, and yet the sky was not careless about this small house. Alcmene was a careful woman who valued plain order and fair dealing, and she held the child with the steadiness of long thought. Amphitryon was a soldier and a farmer by turns, well set in his habits, and he carried his house with firm, modest pride. Zeus was the kind of father who never stayed, who touched the world in a moment, and then moved on to other matters. Hera, who had borne much over the years, did not forgive easily, and she kept count, not with words but with a long memory. The city's elders heard of the birth and approved, for they liked families that held together, and they wished the house steady seasons. A single lamp gave a thin, steady glow over the crib, and the mother slept for a time while the nurse kept easy watch. The house was not grand, but it stood straight, and that was enough for a family that wanted simple meals and safe rest. Alcmene named the boy in the manner of her people, and she spoke blessings that asked only for strength married to kindness. Amphitryon promised to teach the child the common crafts, to tend horses, mend harness, and keep his hands honest and his head clear. So the figures were set around the crib, and each carried a place in the story that would hold for many turning years. First, Hera sent 2 snakes down the hall, choosing the hour when the house was still and the moon kept its distant course. Then, the nurse drowsed on her stool, and Amphitryon slept, and the child lay awake under the cloth and moved his small hands. The snakes found the threshold and came across the floorboards, their bodies steady, their eyes fixed on the crib where the child lay. A faint hiss threaded the room as they neared the blanket, and the nurse stirred, sensing trouble, but the boy had already set himself. Next, his hands reached for the nearest neck, not in fear but with a firm grip that closed where the scales slid beneath his fingers. He took the second creature as well, and he held both with the same strange calm, while his face kept the loose look of a child. The nurse woke to the sight and ran for Amphitryon, and the household gathered, but the danger was already passing into stillness. Hercules, with his hands fixed and his arms braced, held the snakes until their bodies went slack and their tongues no longer tested the air. At last Amphitryon stood by the cradle and considered the child, and he took him up, careful, thoughtful, and full of wonder. The women loosened the linens and found the marks of the coils, and they offered prayers of thanks, though they did not know whom to thank. The story reached neighbors, then friends in nearby farms, and soon elders from the council wanted to see the infant who had ended the threat. He was born in Thebes. Hera kept watch, and he gripped the two snakes in his cradle until they were still. Some said this meant a god had fathered him. Others said it meant a hard life had entered the house, and both held a portion. Amphitryon weighed his pride against his caution, and he chose to raise the boy as his own, though he understood the risk of envy. Alcmene took counsel from a seer who set forth trials and service, and she nodded, accepting both the burden and the likely honours. A thin line of incense smoke rose by the doorway while the family made thanks, and the house felt newly marked by a weight of purpose. Neighbours brought small tokens, a carved toy, a sprig of laurel, a little charm to hang, and they said the child would guard their gates. Amphitryon set new rules for the household, so no loose boasts or careless talk would invite anger from above, and he kept them without fuss. People began to say the boy would be a helper to many, though he would pay for that strength with long work and the strain of service. The path ahead waited in simple pieces, first learning, then a test, then further tasks, and each would shape him toward the life we remember. By the next season, the house had settled around the infant's presence, and chores and talk made room for him without much trouble. Amphitryon still rose early, and Alcmene kept her lists, and the baby grew, as babies do, with steady temper and sure limbs. Visitors told the story of the snakes, and pointed to the marks the coils had left, and then they went home to their dinners. Hera did not forget, and Zeus did not return, and between those two truths, the mortal days went on with their plain weight. The watchful sky held its course, and the child's strength stayed quiet inside him, waiting for work that would meet it with proper need. A mild evening breeze touched the courtyard and moved the hanging cords a little, while Alcmene closed her eyes and rested from the day. The strength he showed against the snakes remained a sign, not of loud triumph, but of how his hands would match the work ahead. It told Amphitryon to study him with care, and it told Alcmene to season kindness with firmness, so the boy learned measure. We return to the main thread, which was simple enough, that a child in Thebes began life under a jealous gaze and a steady roof. From that plain start, his days would lead by degrees toward lessons and larger tests, step by step, with strength used for purpose. Chapter 2. Training. The Kithaeron Lion, and a quiet house. He grew tall under Amphitryon's roof, where work began early and held steady through the day, because the house valued calm hands and clear purpose. First he learned to lift without waste, then to set weight down without noise, and finally to let strength be the last answer, not the first. Amphitryon spoke little, but he pointed to tasks that shaped patience, like hauling water straight, stacking wood square, and closing doors without a jerk. The yard kept him busy with simple drills that made his back sure, and his breath even while he counted steps across packed earth. Sometimes he worked alongside Aphicles, who was quick with tools and slow with praise, and that temper steadied the larger boy more than scolding could. The only time they let him show all his power was when a sled stuck or a beam needed lifting, and even then he moved like a cart horse, slow and set. He grew into his height like a tree that did not hurry, and the lines of his shoulders came from repetition, not swagger, which pleased the quiet house. The smell of oiled leather hung in the yard when he took up old straps for practice, a plain scent that tied work to memory and kept him centered. He did not seek a crowd, and he did not avoid one, because he saw that both could be useful if an errand called. By small chances he learned that strength needed a reason, and once it had one, it needed a direction, the way water needed a clean ditch. In these years the streets of Thebes ran straight from gates to market, and its fields rolled out in neat rows that minded the river. The city felt older than his worries, which gave him rest, because the walls had seen men come and go and had not been troubled. He walked those streets with Amphitryon on market days, carrying what needed carrying, and he watched how folks solved small problems without flurry. First he learned where to stand in a crowd, then how to listen without breaking in, and then how to answer so that anger cooled instead of built. By the next season he knew which gate would be quiet at dawn, and which road brought news before others, and he kept such notes as tools. The low ring of bronze from practice shields drifted from a nearby yard, and it put a steady beat in his feet as he walked beside his kin. He watched soldiers come and go, not with envy, but with the eyes of someone reading how tasks were given and how they were shared. The priest at a small shrine nodded at him now and then, and in return he nodded back because courtesy greased the course of a day. When storms swept the plain, Amphitryon checked roofs with him and showed which knots held and which lashings were for show, a simple lesson with lasting weight. These walks made the city smaller, and by making it smaller, they made his mind larger, because borders and names turned into lived paths. The tutors came by ones and twos, not to grand halls, but to the same yard where chores made sense and pride had little room. An old horseman taught reins and wheels, saying that a chariot was less about speed than about lines, and lines were only hands that stayed true. A patient archer from the hills showed him distance, which was not a matter of eyes alone, because wind and habit needed counting as well. First they had him stretch the cord without an arrow, then hold the pull without a flinch, and then let it ease back like breath returning. The dry twang of the bowstring marked each good release, a small sound that sat in the ear and told him when he had done enough. Amphitryon sat on a step during the lyre lessons, because counting time trained timing, and nimble fingers helped to grip. A stern wrestler from neighboring farms taught holds that used a foe's push against him, and the boy learned to step aside instead of through. He was told never to strike first, only to move first, which seemed a small change, and turned out to be the heart of many wins. When he tired early, they cut the drill and sent him to water. And when he could work longer, they kept the drills slow to keep sense. By patience and small praise, they made power into a craft, and craft into habit, which was the shape Amphitryon had hoped to see. Word came from shepherds that a lion raided herds on Mount Kithaeron, and a few men had tried for it, but none had stayed the course. He asked simple questions about paths and grazing hours, and he walked the lower slopes by day to see where the beast preferred to cross. First he cut a straight sapling and shaved it into a club. Then he walked the tracks again, and then he set a plan that wasted nothing. He slept in a sheltered fold, and rose before light, because the lion liked the edge between night and morning, where watchfulness often slipped. The cold mountain air pressed his face and tightened his hands, and he let it do its work because wakefulness was part of the waiting. He stacked stones near a narrow path to guide the beast's stride, and he stood where the swing could land without glancing off a slope. When the shoulders showed between scrub, he did not rush. He counted the steps, and he let the heavy head draw close enough for one blow. The club fell with the clean line he had learned, and when the beast dropped, he stepped in to finish the work without waste or flourish. He tied legs with a strap and took the path down, stopping where the ground allowed, and keeping the load even so nothing bumped loose. Back in the low country he spoke little, and he laid the hide at Amphitryon's feet, not as a boast but as proof that the drills had meaning. Thebes took notice in a plain way, with fewer fearful messages and more steady travel by roads that had felt unsafe for too long. Creon, who governed there in those days, asked him to sit at his table, and over such simple shared hours he met Megara, his daughter. He spoke little and listened more, and she seemed to like that balance, for it matched the house she came from and the pace she kept. They married without noise, and the city found comfort in the match, because it promised a strong hand that did not make a show. He worked fields, settled quarrels, and stood the line when raiders tested the borders, and the old chores felt useful in a wider circle. Warm lamplight pooled inside their doorway at evening, and it marked a pause between the outside world and their small peace within those walls. She kept the house steady, he kept the roads honest, and together they made a season that earned no song, and yet it held their hearts. So far, he was learning to guide strength. By the next winter they had a rhythm that made hard tasks easier to bear, and he began to think that work and rest could live as neighbours. In time other calls would come, and because of these calm years they would weigh more on him than any load he had carried before. It was a plain stretch of life, and that was its worth, because plain stretches held a man together tighter than any sudden triumphs did. He had chosen the work that asked more of him, not because praise followed it, but because it felt right to spend strength where it belonged. The lion on Cytheron had taught him that careful steps mattered more than flashes, and the club swung straight because the drills had sunk deep. Megara's quiet company taught him that rest was not waste, and that a home was built from the same patience that tamed weight and speed. We returned to the main thread by saying that force, shaped by purpose, was becoming his habit, and habit held gently was becoming character. He had chances to boast and did not take them, and he had chances to quit and did not, because staying the line felt like the only fair choice. The faint crackle of a hearth sounded at evening in their house, and it set a tone that matched his new way of meeting the day. He knew roads and hills better now, and he knew faces and tempers, and such knowing saved time later when travel grew longer and tasks grew strange. What began in a yard with old straps and drills had widened to a city and a household that trusted him to keep his balance. He stood ready, not eager, and that difference, quiet as it was, marked the hard road he had chosen and the steadier way he meant to walk. Chapter 3. Grief, the Oracle, and the First Two Labours. The change came quietly in their stone house, and no warning gave him any shelter from the turning of his mind. A mist, sent by Hera, who had watched him since his first breath, settled over him and bent his sight away from love. In that cruel fog he moved through his rooms as if walking a narrow bridge, and he struck at shadows he thought were foes. When it passed with the same suddenness, the hearth gave a low red glow, and he stood among what grief leaves behind. He knew Megara would not answer, and the children would not rise, and a weight like winter settled on his chest. He did not shout or curse the gods, because speech seemed small near that weight, and he stepped into the yard alone. Neighbors watched from doorways, and Amphitryon, older and slower, understood nothing except that the strong boy he raised had broken in the heart. Hercules washed, wrapped what remained, and laid them out with care, because even in wreckage his hands still knew the habits of kindness. Night came, and he sat with his back to the wall, holding the club he had used in better days, and he waited without moving. By morning he had only one thought that made any sense, which was to seek a place where clear words might reach him. In the days after the burial, he walked away from Thebes, following small roads that did not ask questions and gave steady ground. By the next moon he came to the slopes that led to Delphi, where people went when their own thoughts were no longer enough. He climbed without hurry, because haste had lost its place with him, and he stood before the stones that kept the old seat. The thin smoke of burned laurel hung in the clear air, and a line of pilgrims waited with bowed heads, moving forward one by one. He waited as they waited, neither first nor last, and when it came to his turn he gave his name and spoke without defense. He said he had done a terrible thing under a god's pressure, and he asked where he could put his days so they made sense. The priestess sat above the chasm, and the words came as they always came, not as commands, but as a direction that could be followed. He was told to go to King Eurystheus and take whatever work the king set down, and to keep at it until release came. That was all, and it was enough, because it matched the way he had lived since he was a boy, with task after task. He thanked the god, left an offering within his means, and started down the path that would carry him squarely toward his debt. Eurystheus ruled from a strong town with high walls, yet he was the kind of man whose courage depended on distance and doors. He had been born from the same tangled stories that produced Hercules, but his spirit took smaller paths and liked to have others do the lifting. Hera kept her attention on both of them, pulling threads where she could, since every move against the son reminded the father who had strayed. The court wrote orders with neat hands, and messengers pinned seals to cords, while Hercules stood in the open and accepted each line without complaint. His own tools were the same as ever, a rough club, a bow that kept true in the pull, and a hide for bad weather. He would later add the pelt of a certain beast, but for now he wore plain travel cloth, and walked with the form he had earned. Iolaus, his nephew, stayed nearby and knew when to speak and when to keep still, which made him a rare help in tangled moments. Eurystheus spoke from his raised seat, and his voice came thin across the hall, naming the first hard errand. The Nemean lion had troubled the country, he said, and the lion took sheep and men without fear because bronze bit no part of its hide. There would be another task after that, he added, and Hercules bowed his head once and walked out to begin what had been set before him. He went to Nemea first, asked plain questions of shepherds, found where ewes vanished, and marked the ground until he knew the beast's habits. Arrows skipped from its hide like thrown pebbles, so he set traps and closed paths, then walked straight in and met the lion in its strength. It rushed. He held his ground. The club fell once to stun and once to anger, and finally he gripped its neck and crushed the breath. Afterward he learned the skin yielded only to its own claw, so he took what he needed and carried the heavy pelt across his shoulders. He brought it back, and Eurystheus flinched at the sight and told him to leave trophies at the gate, which Hercules accepted as ordinary caution. Then the king named the second labour, which lay near the marshes of Lerna, where a many-headed serpent rose from the water and ruined fields. Hercules walked there with Iolaus, because a clear head beside grief steadied his steps, and they pressed through reeds with patience rather than fury. The air above the swamp hung wet against his skin, and he set his feet where the ground held firm and waited for the first charge. He chopped, and two heads grew for one, so he shifted his thinking and called Iolaus to bring a torch and hold close to his work. Each neck he cut, Iolaus burned at the root, until the flailing slowed and the immortal head remained, which he pinned under a lifted stone. He returned carrying the lion's hide on his back, and Eurystheus stepped backward toward a storage jar and spoke through its rim without stepping out. The king said the second labour did not count because another hand had helped, and Hercules nodded, because arguing would not move a man like that. He was told to take more tasks in any case, and he agreed, since agreement here meant more chances to put order into broken days. He cleaned the blade, buried the Hydra's immortal head beneath a heavy rock, and smeared the creature's black venom on his arrows for later use. The bronze jar gave a dull ring when the lid shifted, and the court scribes kept writing as if nothing unusual had happened in the hall. Hercules kept the lion skin with him because it stopped wind and weather, but also because it reminded him to face trouble without complaint. He slept lightly, ate what was at hand, and spoke little, since his mind held the long list of errands that now had his name. So far he had turned loss into steady work, and that work set his feet in a straight line he could follow. More would be sent at him soon, from hills and swamps and strange pens, and he would meet them in the same quiet manner. For the moment he waited for the next summons, and the waiting itself felt like a task, which he handled by breathing and standing still. What he learned in those first tasks was simple enough, though it held him for years, which was that steady duty could hold a broken heart. He could not undo what had been done in the quiet house, but he could keep harm from other doors by moving where he was pointed. Orders came, and he carried them, not because the king deserved honor, but because the burden shaped him into someone safer for those nearby. The lion had shown him that some things yielded only to the long grip, and the hydra had shown him that wits and help save time and blood. He kept the venom for later, not as a boast, but as a reminder that even ruin could be turned into a tool with care. A small wind moved the grass along the road as he walked from one errand to the next, keeping his pace even and unforced. People would speak his name when he passed, and some would hide, and some would ask for help, and he answered each with the same plain nod. He was not chasing glory, because glory had no weight, and only work had weight, which he was content to carry without talking about it. There were more labors coming across the horizon, and he did not hurry toward them, yet he did not step away either, which kept him balanced. By keeping his eyes on the next task and only the next, he found a kind of peace that did not ask for praise. Chapter 4. The Hind, by the Ladon and the Boar, from the Snow. He set out from the city with a plain order and a promise beside it, which was to harm nothing living. Eurystheus had named the Ceryneian hind, the deer with golden horns, and warned that Artemis kept claim over it and the hills around. Hercules listened without complaint and took his bow, his club and a coil of rope, because tasks were clearer when his hands knew their tools. He left early and set his pace to match a creature that never tired, stopping only when tracks lost meaning or the land turned rough. Word travelled ahead that he was chasing a sacred thing, and some folk stepped aside while others offered small maps drawn in the dust. He thanked them and asked little, since he had learned that too many voices made a task wobble, and he preferred a clear path. In the hills he kept steady time with his own breath, letting each rise and fall smooth the old ache that still lived quietly. First he crossed fields where farmers had set up low fences. Then he slipped through timberlands where the ground asked careful feet and a careful mind. He carried patience like another tool, and he kept it near the top of the bundle because this task needed weighting more than muscle. When night came, he lay still and counted the work yet ahead, and he rested without hurry because a rushed hand would fail. In those months he moved mostly in Arcadia, a tangle of ridges and valleys where the deer had space to vanish between old groves. He kept to narrow paths and creek edges, because hard ground carried tracks longer, and lost time could be gathered there with small gains. The air smelled of pine, and it helped him mark places when the hills began to repeat themselves in his memory. He guessed the hind crossed borders each season, so he traced a circle rather than a line, visiting springs when they ran and meadows when they held. Then he set small markers with stones, so he could tell where he had been without needing to ask the land again. He spoke aloud at times, a simple line about the next bend or the last hoof print, because ordinary words kept his mind from straying. When he met hunters, he traded bread for news, and when he met shepherds, he traded news for directions, and then moved on. He did not hurry the hills, because hills never hurried anyone, and that lesson settled itself in him as steady as a breath. Sometimes he noted quick movement far ahead, and only a line of prints behind it, so he filed that in his mind and waited. By the end of the first season he understood that this was not a chase meant to end quickly, but a slow approach toward trust. The hind itself mattered most, a creature marked by Artemis, and allowed its golden crown as a sign that hands should be careful around it. Artemis stood close to the story even when unseen, protector of wild things and guardian of promises made about gentle hands. Eurystheus remained the same, a worried king who liked lists and locks, and who measured success by what could be displayed briefly before him. Hercules carried simple tools and a patient mind, and he added a long leather thong meant more for guiding than binding, to keep harm away. There were guides as well, though he refused most of them, and the clearest guide was small habit: count tracks, mark water, and keep distance. In the northern slopes lived Pholus, a mild centaur with a tidy cave and a habit of listening first, which soothed most worries. Pholus kept a jar of wine by custom for guests of his kind, but Hercules asked him to keep it sealed unless the others agreed. Beyond those friends and rulers, there was the Erymanthian boar, a heavy brute that ruled the drifts and rooted fear into many small villages. Boar, deer and god set the bounds of the work, and Hercules aimed to walk inside those bounds as a worker who remembered sorrow. He knew that the land itself counted as a figure here, because hills taught patience and winter taught order in a way no man could. First he followed a line of tracks to the river Lardon, where crossings were narrow and the banks offered places to wait without being seen. He set a small loop of rope across a path, and then stood back behind a trunk, measuring how the herd might break and settle. He waited a long day and a longer night, and then another day, because the deer deserved time to decide whether to trust the path. At last the hind came near the water, moving with that even grace he had expected, and he felt the steadiness of his own breath return. A faint splash reached him, and he slipped the loop into place without tightening it, letting the deer choose where to place its next step. When the loop settled around a foreleg, he eased the other end and spoke, not to command but to name what he was doing and why. Artemis came then, not in anger but in clear purpose, and she wanted to hear about his service and the promises he kept. He bowed his head and told her he would return the deer untouched after showing it to the king, and he would honor her claim upon it. She weighed his words and the way his hands had not tightened the rope. Then she allowed him to lead the hind away for a time. He walked slowly beside it to Tiryns, and when Eurystheus stepped out to sea, Hercules loosened the rope and watched the deer return home. After the hind was safe, Hercules turned north and west toward Mount Erymanthus, where word of a great boar had been troubling the low villages. He stopped with Pholus for a night, and they shared plain food and long talk until the talk came around to the old wine kept for kin. Pholus opened it carefully as custom allowed, and other centaurs arrived quickly, and the mix of stories and old hurts boiled up before anyone wished it. Hercules stood between quick tempers and tried to calm the room, but the press of bodies turned rough and a scuffle broke loose along the slope. Several were hurt in the scramble, and later grief came when Pholus was lost by an accident that he would have undone if time allowed. Hercules carried that weight as he climbed into higher ground, and the snow creaked underfoot while he traced the boar's rounds from thicket to wallow. He did not set traps that would cut, and he did not use barbs, because the order had turned his hand toward catching rather than killing. Then he guided the animal toward deeper drifts with wide circling, until its legs tired and it slowed into a breathing mound. He slid the rope behind its tusks, rolled it gently onto a sled, and hauled it downhill to Tiryns, where Eurystheus hid behind a big jar again. So patience held. Rivers and restless flocks waited next, though he did not know the shape of that work yet, and he only knew his stride felt steadier. When he thought back on those hills, he saw that both tasks had asked him to stand aside from his usual way and wait. First there was the deer that carried another's claim, which he honored with a bowed head and a rope that never cut into skin. Then there was the boar that ruled its patch by force, and he learned to bring it down by walking circles rather than swinging hard. These were not triumphs to raise high or retell with fuss, because steady labor had done most of the lifting and set the tone for later. He had wanted forgiveness from his own mind, and he found a shape of it when a wild thing stood near him without fear. The hills gave him room to breathe, and to accept a land that did not judge him, and he answered by moving carefully where he went. Friends had helped and been lost, and he carried that with the same steadiness he used with rope, because nothing that mattered should be hurried. When winter light lay over the hills, he felt that the world could be strong and kind at once, and he tried to hold that lesson. He walked back to his lodging with the slow certainty that tasks would keep coming, and he could meet them without breaking the things they touched. By keeping calm hands and giving time its due, he had made a beginning that would steady him for the work that still waited. Chapter 5. Rivers threw stone and feathers in the air work, waited for him in Elatus, where King Ogyges kept vast herds, and a problem that had been left to grow for years. The stables stretched long along the river plain, heavy with neglect, and the thought of shovels alone would have been a fool's answer. He stood and looked not at the filth first, but at the lay of the ground, the slope, and the nearby water's steady patience. Flies droned in the light as he paced along the walls, and traced with his hands the seams where stone met mud. He had learned by the hind and the boar that time and quiet planning could do what fists could not, and he kept that lesson close. Eurystheus had sent him with the same cold voice, yet the weight of the order sat differently now, more like work he understood. Ogyges smiled in that way a king does when he believes labor will break the man who takes it, but Hercules did not take offense. He asked simply how many days the king expected from any team, and then he offered his promise to do it in 1 day only. The king agreed with a shrug and a private nod to his stewards, and the people watched with a kind of tired curiosity from the fences. So Hercules went to fetch stakes and lines, and he kept his mind on water rather than on muck, because the first would move the second. In these middle years of his service, he He came to the lowlands of Elis, where two sister streams curved across the broad fields. The sour smell of old manure hung in the still air and seemed to press against the chest as if it had weight. Cattle had been counted not by tens or hundreds, but by herds upon herds, and their keeping had outpaced the hands meant to tend them. The walls were sound, yet the gates were small, and a dozen men with shovels would have failed before sundown, and again the day after. He walked the bank and measured with his eyes the height of the river against the stable yard, then set his stakes to mark a path. First he traced a shallow arc that would meet the stable wall at a strong corner. Then he marked a second line that led away. The overseers muttered about pride and wager, yet he did not answer, because the ground itself gave plainer counsel than an argument. He cut sod and loosened earth, and he asked a few farmhands to bring mattocks, spades and boards, which they passed along quietly. By midday the channels began to take a shape a child could read, and the stewards finally leaned close enough to see his intent. He kept his steps even and his voice low, for steady work over a measured course would make the day do more than muscle alone. Ogaes was a big man with a wide belt, careful eyes, and a habit of making bargains that kept his wealth very near his hand. His son Phyleus stood straighter than most, and spoke plainly, and he watched Hercules without the smirk that sat around the other mouths. Eurystheus waited far away in Mycenae, restless for reports, and always ready to mark a stroke against the man he had set to labour. The rivers themselves mattered as much as any king, because they were old workers who needed only a path, not a spur or a whip. The stable yard crew brought what they had, which was little pride, and enough tools to open ground, and some looked relieved to be led. A few elders came to the fence and pointed to the low ridge where the channels would turn, and their nods told him the land would hold. Beyond this place, in the Arcadian marsh of Stymphalus, a different trouble waited, a wheeling flock with bronze beaks and a taste for flesh. Those birds were said to belong to a god of war, and their feathers were as cruel as small blades, falling dangerous as they dropped. Hercules had arrows that had tasted the Hydra's venom, and he remembered that even a tireless arm could be guided by a patient mind. He set in his thoughts the two tasks side by side, one about water-mastering waste, and one about noise and careful aim against the dark flock. First he broke a section of the stable wall where he had marked the angle. Then he opened the upstream cut and let the current find it. The water did not rush wild across the yard, because he had laid boards and braces to steer the flow along the long-piled filth. He walked the edge and shifted stones with a pole, and the muck rose and slid like a sluggish tide that could be told where to go. Then he opened the second cut so the water would leave cleanly beyond the fields, and he watched the level drop as soil settled again. Ogus came and stared in flat surprise, but the work itself made any words small, since the yards cleared and the walls stood sound. Before the sun went behind the far ridge, he had closed the cuts with fresh-packed earth, and reset the broken wall so cattle would not stray. With the channels closed, he took the inland track toward the marsh where the birds had made trouble. At Stymphalus he met Athena by a quiet bank, and she placed in his hands a bronze rattle, clever and light, made by the smith's craft. When he shook it, the hard clatter jumped across the reeds and sent the flock up at once, and their shapes wheeled above the marsh. He steadied himself and loosed arrow after arrow with slow breath, and the poisoned points beat several from the air while the rest fled wide. Eurystheus heard and found a way to be cross, saying the river work did not count because a price had been named for the day's labour. Augeas, for his part, tried not to pay the price at all and pressed his stewards to swear that no true bargain had ever been made. Phyleus spoke out and held to the truth, and that simple act made the king turn his anger on his own house rather than on Hercules. Hercules took the slight without a shout and walked on, because the work had been done, and the plain now held cleaner ground for its herds. He cleaned the stables and scattered the birds. People in Elis remembered that their river had become a helper when shown a path, and the Arcadians noticed their woods had grown quieter. He felt the day's strain in his shoulders, yet found his thoughts easy, as if the jobs had matched the way his mind liked to move. The evening breeze carried a damp reed smell that seemed gentler than the morning had been, and he slept on bare earth without turning. He woke knowing that each task could be given shape before strength, and this made the road ahead feel less like burden than steady duty. The sea winds would call him next, and he would meet wild power again with hands that knew both gentleness and measure. There was a plain goodness in the way he had turned what already flowed or flew into the means of its own taming, and he kept that in mind. First he had watched the ground and laid a plan that asked water to do the heaviest part. Then he had used noise to thin a threat. He began to trust that a quiet look at a problem could show a line where force would be only the last step, and not the first. He did not pretend there was no strength in him. Yet he liked it better when strength behaved like a patient servant rather than a lord. The talk that reached him had less bite, and even when it did, He let it pass like clouds instead of carrying it like a pack. He had walked from filth to open air in a day, and then from fearsome wings to empty sky in another, and the measure was enough. The soft memory of water slipping against stones stayed with him in quiet moments, and it calmed the rougher weather that still lived inside. He thought of the men who had passed him tools, and of the goddess who had lent small help, and he counted them both as kin. We return to the main thread, and see a man who chose to work with the world rather than against it, even when ordered hard. By this steady habit, the punishment laid on him felt lighter, and the road ahead seemed like work he would accept and finish without fuss. Chapter 6. Sea Winds, a Bull, and the Bitter Stables. He sat among sailors and traders as the boat pointed its nose toward Crete, calm in his work and light on words. They knew his name by then, yet he kept quiet, counting tasks ahead rather than the tales that followed him. Eurystheus had sent a message with strict lines, and the meaning was simple enough that even a tired mind held it. He was to find the bull that had roamed Crete and bring it back, alive if he could manage the strain. The point was control, not ruin, and he understood how that suited the path he had been walking for years. The captain watched him with a wary respect and cleared space, while he set his club and bow where they would not tangle. First came travel, then the careful meeting with a creature that knew nothing of men's plans and little of mercy when stirred. He did not make speeches to the crew, and he did not pretend the sea would change because he climbed aboard. There was only the road laid across water. A quiet stretch of waiting before hands and mind went to steady work. The only sound that marked the hours was the steady slap of waves against the hull. In those weeks after the birds had scattered and the stables had run clean, the summons came to cross south for Crete. Stories said the island king had broken faith with a promise, and the sea god answered by sending a fierce great bull to land. The beast had torn fields, dashed fences, and left men swearing that no yoke would ever bind it for plough or altar. Minos had ruled long and kept good order, yet even he had stepped back from the charge and let it roam. The work asked of Hercules was to master the animal without wasting its strength, and to bring it across the water for display. This matched the lesson he had been learning, that wild power could be led when patience stood in the lead, and anger stayed home. Crete came up from the horizon slow and steady, with towns that had seen ships come and go forever. Men on the quay spoke plainly about the fields, the thin losses, and the days spent mending walls where hooves had pounded through. He listened because those lines of living told him where to stand and how to wait when the meeting came near. A taste of salt sat on his lips as he stepped from the boat onto the stone, and he took it as a welcome. Minos met him in the court and gave a nod that meant permission rather than welcome, and that was enough for clear work. The bull had been born from a god's whim and a man's pride, and it had learned quickly that no one on Crete could hold it long. Herdsmen spoke of its straight charge and the way it refused to tire, so Hercules knew he would need grip more than swing. Over the water and far to the north lived Diomedes, a hard king who kept mares that bit men and were trained for killing. Those mares had been yoked to fear and violence, and the land around his stables had grown quiet in the worst kind of calm. Eurystheus had written the next order even before news came back from Crete, as if speed alone might keep him safe from trouble. Hercules had a few companions by then, younger men who watched and tried to learn, and among them was a trusted lad named Abderus. He told them little and showed them much, letting their eyes take in how a strong hand could rest until the right moment. He understood that to face a beast or a cruel keeper, the mind had to set the pace, not the heart that jumped ahead. From the north, those who travelled down spoke of stables where the clatter of iron rings carried across the yard on still mornings. He found the Cretan bull in a rough valley, watched its path for a day, and marked where the ground gave him firm footing. First he let it charge and pass, then he turned and met it head-on, taking the horns and setting his weight without a word. The beast pushed and tossed, but he stayed low and steady, letting strength bleed away until its legs trembled and the fight went thin. When it sagged, he bound the legs with cord, eased it to the ground, and spoke in a level tone that kept his own breath even. He led it to the shore with care, stowed it on the ship, and crossed back while the crew stood wider than usual around him. Eurystheus took one quick look when they arrived and darted for his hiding place, and the bull later slipped free and wandered the mainland. He kept turning force into guidance. Then he turned north for Thrace, took his small band into Diomedes' land, and came to the stables early to break the chain of fear. He overpowered the grooms, led the mares out, and left Abderus to hold them while he met the king, and stopped his charge with both hands. Diomedes fell to the ground and paid for his cruelty, and the mares, once fed, grew docile enough to tie and move without trouble. The hot breath of the bull had burned his forearms earlier, and later the mares stood steady with ropes loose as the day stretched long. When the ground settled and the men stood back from the halters, He looked for Abderus and found only the mark of struggle and a still form. He buried the young man with hands that had done other hard duties, and he set a simple cairn that travellers could find without asking. A town took the name Abdera later, because people liked to tie memory to a place, and that felt right for a good lad. He drove the mares south and brought them to Eurystheus, who gave a thin order to dedicate them and then to let them go far away. In most tellings they wandered off and were ended by the wild hills, and the land in Thrace breathed easier when they did not return. The Cretan bull, freed earlier, moved across the mainland until another hero met it on a different day, which kept the story moving without him. News of these crossings went before him on coasts and islands, and people began to speak of him as a guardian rather than a breaker. He listened without swelling up inside, because he knew praise felt fine at dusk and poorly at dawn when work started again. His own sense of the labour had changed a little. Since he had led 2 storms by the head, and found calm at the end of each, a single gull cried above a harbour when he prepared for the next orders, and the old sea seemed to nod at the way he had handled things. The path ahead would leave the water for a while and cross long plains, and he set his mind to keep the scale of days small. He had started the season with another ship's crossing, and by its end he understood ships a little better, and himself a little better too. First he had taken the bull and turned its rush into a tired bend. Then he had faced the mares and unlearned their hunger. The sea did not make him a sailor, yet it taught him to wait, to look ahead, and to use rope more than rage. He kept the club near, but he also kept his hands open longer, because sometimes a firm hold brought the very calm he needed. People in small places took heart when he passed, and fields recovered where hooves had smashed down, which was a quiet kind of victory. He thought of Abderus now and then, and the thought stayed honest, not raw, reminding him that guidance still carried a cost. Hera's shadow did not lift. Eurystheus still sent lines of orders, and yet the work felt less like punishment and more like a road he could walk. He was not in a hurry with that thought, and he did not decorate it, because plain truth sat better when men were tired. The soft creak of the mast stayed in his memory even on land, a sound that meant steady travel rather than sudden blows. He moved on toward the next fields and far coasts, ready to keep his grip sure and his temper slower, and that was enough for now. Chapter 7. A Queen's Belt and the Red Herd. The list from Eurystheus did not pause, and the next line spoke of a belt and a long drive of cattle. Hercules took this news without fuss, gathered his bow and club, and started along the worn tracks that he knew so well. First he would reach the country of the Amazons, where a queen named Hippolyta wore a girdle prized for rank and honour. Then he would head far west, past lands that had only heard his name, toward an island where red cattle grazed under watch. He kept a steady pace and spoke little, because on long roads a calm breath often lasted longer than a loud boast. In these days he had learned to place duty before triumph, so the work stayed clean in his thoughts and hands. He remembered the mares and the bull, and he set them aside, like tools hung up after honest labour, ready for tomorrow. Along the road he met small villages and lone herdsmen, yet he passed by with gentle nods and asked for little help. The thought of a queen who fought from horseback did not trouble him, because he trusted talks before blows when that made sense. A light wind touched his face and cooled the sweat on his brow, and he smiled at the plain feeling of the day. By the next season he reached the plains near the Thermodon, where the camps of the Amazons lay beyond a wide brown river. He stood on a low rise and counted the tents, with training fields set in rows, and waited for riders to sweep closer. Their order told him much, because people who kept straight lines often kept their word when an agreement felt fair to both sides. He asked for a meeting with Hippolyta and sent his name ahead, not as a boast but as a steady sign of respect. The queen came out with riders at her flanks, their spears held at ease, and she stood before him without fear or pride. Hercules said he had been sent to ask for her belt, and he added that the matter could remain simple if she agreed. Hippolyta weighed his words and weighed him as well, and she nodded once, because a plain request felt better than a raid. She said the girdle marked her as first among equals, and she could spare it when peace promised more gain than a fight. He agreed to offer gifts and to leave at once, keeping his men near the boats, so no one would read threat into his steps. The air held the clean smell of salt from the river mouth, and it sat between them like a reminder to keep tempers cool. Word spread through the camps that a stranger had come with a quiet voice, and that their queen would decide without fear. Hippolyta wore the belt low over her tunic, a gift from her father Ares, and it bound her authority as well as her gear. She treated Hercules like a guest, because his manner stayed clear of insult, and because the old stories carried his steadiness ahead of him. Hera watched from far off and disliked the smooth talk, so she moved to bend the minds of riders who liked sharp answers. A rumour rose that Hercules planned to seize the queen, and that peace was a trick, which pulled hearts into fear and anger. Then the spears came level, and the horses stamped in place, and the neat order began to lean toward a line of charge. Hercules stepped forward and kept his voice even, saying he would take only the belt and go, and he asked no further concession. Hippolyta raised her hand and held back her riders, but the rumor had already taken root, and the calm could not return quickly. There was a short clash near the boats, and some fell, and Hercules grieved that words had failed where they had first succeeded. He took the belt when Hippolyta consented at last, the bronze buckle giving a faint gleam in the shade, and he withdrew at once. He sailed east again to deliver the girdle as promised, and then turned his face toward the far west where another task waited. First he crossed friendly harbours where traders waved from slow boats, then he followed roads through dry hills, and finally he reached the ocean strand. The island of Erythea lay beyond normal crossings, so he called to Helios with simple respect, and the sun god lent his golden cup. Hercules sailed in that cup over the wide stream of ocean, quiet and alert, until the island rose like a low red shield. He stepped ashore to find Eurytion the herdsman and Orthrus the two-headed hound, and he drew near with measured steps and shield readied. The dog came first, so his club fell true, and then the herdsman advanced, and an arrow ended the fight before words could work. Geryon came out from his halls armed in triple fashion, 3 bodies moving with one will, and he shouted a challenge across the sand. Hercules waited for good range, bent his bow, and sent a bitter arrow that pierced through mail and hearts together, ending that strange unity. He gathered the red cattle into a tight herd, marked the lead bulls, and set out with a long staff and patient stride for home. The sun pressed its steady heat on his shoulders as he walked, and the work shrank to steps, breath, and the keep of a flock. The road home stretched across wide plains and towns that asked for stories, but he mostly kept to pastures and moved at dawn and dusk. A band of men in Liguria pressed him for tribute, and he answered with measured force, leaving space for those who wished to leave. He turned south and passed by a riverside cave, where Cacus the thief dragged cattle backward to hide the tracks, and the trick worked poorly. The bulls answered their herd with deep voices, and Hercules traced the hiding place, tore the doors wide, and left the place solemn and finished. When the sea lay near, he set 2 markers upon the straits to show the far reach of that walk, and he turned east again. Hera then sent a gadfly to torment the herd, and the cattle scattered into forests and uplands, forcing days of slow gathering and care. He moved quietly through the broken ground, coaxed frightened steers toward the path, and kept count with pebbles in a small leather pouch. At last he brought the herd to Eurystheus, who squared his shoulders in relief and offered the animals to Hera, trying to keep favor. He had the belt and the cattle now. There was still a road toward the edge of the world ahead, and a trade with a tall bearer, but he slept before that thought. After the talk of courts, he returned to the road and felt again how simple work could clear the weight from his chest. He had come to riders and left with a gift taken in rough hours, then crossed to a far island and led a herd home. The days of walking with cattle reminded him that strength served best when paced, and that pride kept quiet when hands were full of work. He kept his gear plain and his mind on small tasks, counting hooves at crossings and marking turns with small cairns where paths confused strangers. When thoughts strayed to the past, he set them back like stones along a field edge, neat and untroubling until time made space again. He understood now that gifts taken by request could cost less than prizes won by force, though both still weighed the same in the hand. Cattle driven across half the world asked for patience and sleep in spare places, and he had both, learnt from earlier years and quiet nights. He kept pride in check by thinking of ropes, gates and water skins, and let praise slide past like clouds that never touched the ground. A small fire gave off a dry crackle while he rested, and the sound matched the even beat of his breathing and the cattle shifting. He rose at dawn with a quiet spirit, and he faced the next miles knowing that simple steps had carried him through worse and would again. Chapter 8. Apples at the Edge. Hound from Below. He had barely settled from the long drive of Geryon's herd when the next task stood before him like a plain stone. Eurystheus named the apples kept at the world's edge, Hera's own fruit, and he offered no help and no kinder word. Hercules accepted the order and turned west again, because work still steadied him more than any thought of pride or anger. First he asked along the coasts for old names and ways, then he looked for the turn that sailors said led beyond common maps. He packed nothing he did not need, kept his club near, set his lion skin on his shoulder, and kept his mind clear. The old stories placed a garden where the ocean's stream curved, and he trusted those scraps of speech as if they were mile markers. He knew Hera loved those apples and set her watch there, yet he also knew his path ran where duty pointed. So he walked past fields and rough ground, not loudly, but with that heavy grace he had learned to carry without show. The evening air felt cool on his face as he left settled towns behind and watched the land grow quiet by long degrees. By patient steps he came at last to country that looked like an ending, and he paused there to take his bearing. In those days people spoke of the place where earth met sky as a clear line, and he found its sign near tall rocks. There the land rose into a pair of standing heights, which travellers later called the Pillars, casting a simple frame around the far water. He had heard that beyond those heights the Hesperides tended a quiet orchard, and a coiled guardian nested around its trees. The serpent had a name, Ladon, and Hera's favour kept it from sleep, so no stranger reached through its patient loops. Hercules stood off and watched from a ridge, measuring the way gates could be opened without cutting, because that lesson had served him well. The stars hung close above the heights, and their hard brightness made him think of iron made cold by water. He did not hurry, since a wrong step might set the garden against him, and rushing only deepened trouble with such watchers. He remembered another tale about a brother of the race of Titans, set to hold the sky, strong but bound to a single place. If Atlas stood near, the way through might be found by talk, not blows, and that thought sat comfortably with his plan. So he looked for signs of a dwelling or a path used by great feet, and he kept to the clean edges of the ground. Atlas was broad and worn, with a taller reach than any tree, and he looked at Hercules with the simple patience of someone tied to one task. The Hesperides were near but watchful, their hands resting by their sides, and Ladon kept its post and did not relax. Hercules spoke first and offered a clean trade, a rest for Atlas's shoulders while the giant fetched the fruit that only kin could take. Atlas listened and weighed him, not with pride, but with the tired wisdom of someone who knew the shape of long wait. His voice came slow and deep, like thunder moving under a hill, and he agreed if the measure of time were kept fair. Prometheus, laid out not far in another old story's shadow, had already given a hint of the path, and Hercules had answered that old debt. That small deed mattered here, because goodwill softened the air around a bargain when gods and their kin were involved. On the other side of the world another set of keepers would matter soon, for Hades and Persephone kept their own house with firm rules. Cerberus watched their gates with 3 steady heads, not cruel by nature but trained to let no living feet pass without leave. Hermes knew those tracks under the earth and sometimes guided souls, and Hercules kept that guide in mind for the road he would soon take. First Hercules set his club down and stepped beneath the sky's edge, where Atlas shifted his wide burden and taught him the right stance. Then the weight came onto him all at once, pressing through his shoulders and back until his bones found a firm line and held. Atlas straightened and walked away toward the garden, and Ladon settled when a familiar shape approached across the ground. The Hesperides did not cry out, since a child of their house reached for the boughs, and the apples came down without struggle or mark. Hercules waited, counted in a steady way, and kept his hands set just so, because a small slip could pull the sky wrong. Atlas returned with the fruit cradled in his arms and looked lighter, and for a short while he did not wish to take the weight back. He told Hercules he would carry the apples himself to Eurystheus and keep the trade open, and the idea seemed warm to him in that moment. Hercules nodded as if to agree, but then asked for padding for his head and hands, saying he would be steadier once set properly. Atlas lifted the edge to help with the strap, and in that small change Hercules turned and let the sky drop back into its old seat. The apples were in his hands then, and he thanked the giant for the trust, stepped away with care, and set his feet toward Tiryns. Eurystheus took one look at the fruit and hid his fear behind formality, and Athena soon set the apples back where they belonged. With that done, the last order came clear and simple, for Hercules was to bring up Hades' hound without blade or spear raised against it. He went south to the cave at Tanarome, spoke a quiet word for passage, and stepped into the way beneath the earth with his courage steady. The air smelled of damp stone as he walked downward beside Hermes, who knew the turns, and he kept his eyes level and his pace exact. Hades received him without anger when the purpose was explained, and Persephone asked that the creature be handled gently and returned unharmed. Hercules agreed, and wrapped his lion's skin around his arm, then faced Cerberus and waited for the right moment when all 3 heads paused. He moved in close, took the dog by the throat without choking, and held fast through the strain until the great body learned his intent. Then he walked upward with the hound's weight moving beside him, and Eurystheus fled at the sight, and muttered for the beast to be taken away. The apples were taken and returned. His bargain held, and one last promise ended the long account. So a quieter path waited beyond. When he led the hound back and came up alone, he felt the old weight inside him settle, and the labours stood behind him like cairns. He had not broken the unbreakable. He had not stormed the gates. He had bargained, asked leave, and kept to the terms he accepted. The apples were not his to keep, nor was the dog, and he had known that plainly when he touched each task with steady hands. Freedom did not rush at him as a shout. It came as a space in his day, a clear stretch where no command pressed. In these days he walked without a deadline set by another man's fear, and his steps found a slower beat that suited his heart. The morning light lay flat across the road as he moved on, and the lands around him looked simple again after so much range. He thought of the people he had met and the strange households that had opened their doors, and the way a good promise linked such rooms. He knew Hera still watched and that luck could turn. Yet the straight work of the labours had taught him how to adjust his grip. We return to the main thread, and see that a man can hold the sky for a time, not because he is stone but because he is resolved. He carried his freedom like a tool rather than a prize, which was a quiet way to hold a gift, and it kept his path steady. Chapter 9. Marriage, a misstep, and a season of humble work. He came down from the last labour with a quietness that surprised even him, and he looked for a place where peace might hold. The roads felt known, yet he walked them like a guest, holding back from loud steps and the easy boasts of harder days. Word reached him in those weeks of a woman in Calydon, whose father weighed suitors like a careful trader, and he turned his feet that way. Her name was Deianira, and stories said she favoured steady hearts more than bright armour or quick tongues at crowded gates. He did not send heralds or bring a train, because he had learned that quiet entry made a house breathe easier. Wainius, her father, welcomed him to the benches and listened while he spoke few words about wandering, service and the shape of home. Others had come ahead to claim her, and a river among them swelled with pride, promising fertile fields and lasting strength under his name. Hercules sat and kept still, watching elders weigh the claims while his hands remembered lions and the pull of oars on long waters. A small fire crackled in the hall as night lengthened, and he let that homely sound slow his thoughts while patience did its work. He had crossed many lands by force, but he hoped this turning might be gentler, and he hoped to earn a roof by simple measure. In Calydon the matter came clear in morning, when the river Acala stood in the yard, swelling within a strange man's shape. He spoke of old claims and wide banks, asking the house to honour his promise of fields that never failed under his name. Hercules stepped forward without ceremony, first with open hands and then with a firm stance, because contests felt easier than tangled words. Achilles shifted and showed horns like a great bull, and as he stamped the earth a damp smell rose like opened riverbanks. Hercules closed, took hold and held his ground, as he had on other mornings when he matched power with patient purpose. The river god coiled like a snake and slipped, yet each time he changed, Hercules answered with the same plain hold he had learned. First he found the neck, then the shoulder, and after that the horn, until the old river yielded to the steady weight of careful hands. When the horn came loose and lay in his palm, the boast left the yard, and the elders breathed in and then out again together. Hercules set the horn down for Oeneus to keep, a good token for the table, and he asked only to stay. By evening Deianira took his hand at the door, and the house agreed that steadiness had chosen steadiness, while the river turned away. Deianira proved quiet in speech and careful in judgment, and she watched him to see whether calm would stay with him. Oeneus favoured stories told after the day was done, and his eyes carried pride for his line, and a long weariness from wars. Attalus kept his distance and sent no new trouble, which pleased the farmers who needed more rain and less argument in their fields. Others came and went in those months, and among them was talk of Eurytus of Otatlia, proud of his bow and his daughters. There was also Iphitus, a son who trusted fairness, whose steps were light on the threshold, as if he disliked burdening any house. His manner was open, and he spoke of lost mares and a wish to find them without making any neighbour endure blame. Far away in Lydia lived Queen Omphale, who ruled with an even hand, listened before she judged, and kept her wealth in neat order. Traders from her lands passed through with bright cloth and small coins, and their wares clicked softly when poured from their narrow bags. Hercules heard these names and kept them in mind, because on long roads the next house and the next face often mattered. He wanted to be a good husband and a steady neighbour, yet the world did not always let a man choose his pace. First he set his home with Deianira in Trachis, where King Ceyx gave welcome, and the hills stood mild around their days. Then news travelled of Eurytus and a contest he boasted about, and Hercules went to test his skill but found only hard pride. The king withdrew the promised prize and mocked the guest, and Hercules left with a steady face, though the sting stayed under quiet words. Time passed, cattle grazed, and a winter thinned, and through the gate came Iphitus asking for help to track stolen mares from his father. Hercules received him as a friend, walked with him along the wall, and spoke about tracks and pastures and neighbours who sometimes hid trouble. A troubled fog crossed his mind in that walk, an old unrest he neither wanted nor welcomed, and his hands did what sorrow later grieved. He lifted Iphitus and hurled him down from the height, and the ground took a good man while silence fixed itself on the stones. He covered his face and went to Delphi for cleansing, but the god's voice turned away, calling the blood his own to carry. He lifted the tripod in anger and dragged it toward the door, and Apollo came in heat to seize it back from him. A crack of thunder split the air, and the two stood apart at once, and he saw he had crossed beyond ordinary quarrels. After that he accepted a plainer path, letting himself be sold into service, and he went to Lydia to work under Queen Omphale. She received him without fear or flattery, set him simple tasks, and asked more often for patience than for blows or the show of weapons. Sometimes she put the lion's skin over her own shoulders and laughed, and he took soft linen and a spindle, and learned steady threads. He carried her baskets, kept her roads clear, and on some days brought back thieves who frightened small towns near the fields and orchards. He caught trickster brothers who made faces at honest men, and he turned their jokes into work, patching bridges and filling ruts. The smell of dyed wool hung sweet and a little sharp in the workrooms, a homely note that sat with him better than any shout. He learned to wait for a question, learned to set down a pride that could lift mountains, and learned to enjoy the quiet turn of hours. He grew lighter there, and he wrote to Trachis with a steadier hand, telling of days that ended without blood and began without dread. So the path had bent, yet he kept learning steadiness where anger once stood in him. Soon he would go home to Dalianira with easy steps, not knowing a small turn waited beside a restless river crossing. When his term under Omphale ended, he stood a little different, less quick to judge, and more careful about the wave rising inside him. He had held up the sky for another once, and now he held up his own hands, choosing restraint where he once chose heat. The labours had shown him how to move mountains, but these months showed him how to set a heavy mood down before it hardened. He thought of Deianira and the steadiness in her face, and he hoped the house in Trachis could take this new balance and keep it. He sent gifts ahead, simple things for the table and the yard, because he wanted his return to feel like good weather returning. He kept the memory of Iphitus close and weighty, and it taught him to walk slower by heights and to listen longer to doubt. The anger had not vanished, but it had learned its place, and he had learned that strength bowed more easily to a kind word. Evening light lay pale on the threshold when he reached Trachis, and he felt the world settle around him like a cloak put right. What came later would rise from old crossings and old horns, but for now the house held him, and their breaths met evenly. He slept that night as a man at harbour, the oar blades shipped, the sea at rest, and the shore finally near. Chapter 10. From the quiet pyre to the open sky. He came down from work and from travel to a quiet stretch near Trachis, where home waited with patient care and steady routines. He had carried many hurts and healed most by moving forward, so simple days felt welcome, and he looked for small repairs. Deianira kept house as best she could, and fear sometimes visited her, as rumours seemed to follow him like travelling dust. Nessus had died by his hand long before, and with dying breath had wrapped a lie inside a talk of keeping love. In a moment of hope and worry mixed, she sent a robe touched with that blood, certain it would keep his heart steady. He pulled the tunic on before a simple rite, trusting her good heart and not guessing how deeply the old trick had set. Heat rose where the cloth lay, not like honest fire from a hearth, but a slow, biting heat under the cloth and skin. He stood his ground at first and breathed through it, then knew this hurt had a different root and would not let go. He asked for help in plain words and chose a high place, calling for Mount Oeta, where the ridge met the open sky. The men around him listened and steadied him, and the day turned toward that mountain path without sharp complaint from anyone near. In these hours they reached Mount Oeta, a long back of stone and scrub where shepherds sometimes passed, and fires had seen offerings before. The mountain wind was cool on his face, and its plain touch steadied him more than words could manage in that moment. He had men gather dry limbs, and he pointed where to place them, choosing a flat ledge where the slope fell gently away. First they cleared the stones and laid timbers in a crosswise stack. Then they faced one another and took quiet measure of things. He spoke without strain, thanking each friend for staying, and he asked that word be kept kind for Deianira, who had meant no harm. The small jobs continued in steady order, and there was no rush, because he liked work done right, even when the hour pressed. They laid a cloak upon the wood, and they spread his club and lion skin nearby, reminders of seasons that had already turned. He asked for his bow and arrows, and he rested them across his knees, as if seeing old companions before leaving a field. A few from Trachis kept their distance, and a few stayed close, while each found a way to stand with quiet respect. When all was set, he nodded once, and lay down upon the stacked wood, which held him level and let his breath ease. His son Hylas stood near the foot of the pyre, his jaw set hard, listening to each small request as if it were law. The young man had learned steadiness from watching him work, and this moment called for that same steadiness, not tears or loud display. He told Hylas to keep the house safe and to make peace where peace could be made, since home carried long roots into tomorrow. Word came that Deianira had fallen under grief when the truth reached her, and he let the news pass across him without blame. He asked if any among them would set the fire, and the circle went quiet, because respect held them and fear stood nearby. A traveller named Philoctetes stepped forward at last, a bowman with clear aim and plain manners, willing to finish what had been started. Hercules placed his bow in that man's hands, and the bow felt smooth with old use, a trust shaped by years of good service. He spoke to Zeus in measured words, almost like a worker speaking to a master he knew, asking for a clean end to trial. He also named Hera without anger, remembering how her care had tested him, and he said he was ready for a different kind of day. Hermes was somewhere on the path between, as Hermes often was, and the thought of a guide made the road ahead seem simple. First Philoctetes knelt and touched fire to the edge, and the small crackle of kindled twigs began its plain, patient work upward. Then Hylas stepped back, and the others stepped back, while Hercules lay still and kept his gaze easy, meeting each face with calm. He spoke a last time to the men, saying that labor had been his path, and had taught him simple things worth keeping. He named patience, he named measure, and he named the quiet mind that listens first, then acts, because that way had rarely failed him. The work of burning advanced along the logs without hurry, and the robe that had carried harm now seemed to carry it away. He closed his eyes as if easing into sleep, and his breath slowed, and the weight of wounds no longer asked for attention. What could be burned was burned, and what could not be burned stood clear inside him, steady and ready for a change of home. In that turn, he seemed lighter than any tale had ever claimed, and the long cost of his steps no longer pressed him down. The gods made room for him, and Hermes took his arm with a worker's grip, leading him from the ridge toward their broad ways. He left the pyre to finish its duty behind him, and he moved forward as a man walks into open ground after hardship. By the next season, if seasons could be counted beyond clouds, he was within the high house where the gods kept their steady order. A clear light lay over the halls, not sharp, just even, and it seemed to speak of work without rush or burden. Zeus greeted him not with thunder but with a father's nod, saying the measure of mortal labor had been taken and accepted. Hera stood beside that greeting, and the old edge between them eased as he bowed his head and thanked her for watchfulness, however hard. She answered in kind, saying that strength without trial grows wild, and that his steadiness had turned a rough gift into something useful. Athena gave a small smile, and Hermes stood a half step back, pleased to have guided a traveller who preferred direct roads and honest tools. Hebe came forward with quiet hands and a manner that held no judgment, and the moment gentled as she promised a calm home. He was given a place among those who sat at table, and he was given lighter tasks that tended to mending rather than breaking. So the pain was set down, and he was lifted into quieter company, with the old burdens finally sliding away in their proper time. His marriage to Hebe followed with simple vows among friends, and together they kept a hearth where kindness and rest were daily companions. In years after, people told the story in small houses and along fields, and the tale walked easily because the end was gentle. They said he had set his tools down and taken a seat where storms passed without worry, and that seemed fair. The gods kept their word about peace, and Hera's care turned to watchfulness without spite, which let his name rest lightly in her halls. When people worked through a hard task, they remembered that he had valued measure over show, and the reminder helped them take the next step. They also remembered that strength had served better when guided by patience, and that a day could be saved by steady hands and time. On Olympus he kept small tasks with Hebe, pouring ease for travelers and staying mindful of those who tried to shoulder more than they could carry. Hermes visited often, and Athena sometimes asked his view on matters of courage, because living through hard seasons had taught him careful ways. He kept no ledger of victories there, and he did not count praises, since the work he liked best was the easing of trouble. Travellers on earth still left a stone at waysides for him, and his name sat quiet beside their road as if keeping company. When the night air seemed mild, people believed he was near, and that was enough to keep hearts steady and at ease. And so, dear knight, our tale of Hercules and his mighty labours comes to an end. May your rest be peaceful, and may your dreams carry the strength of heroes. Until our next story, ride onward beneath the stars. Good night.